Right. This video ended up being pretty long. I'm going to be putting timestamps down in the description, and just to give a quick rundown of what you can find at those timestamps. The first part is kind of going over some background on the first set of dyno testing I did, which was 6 different intake setups on the stock headers. The next part is going to be just a quick summary of what I actually found with the SME headers. I know some people are basically just going to want the numbers, so if you're interested in the numbers and nothing else, jump to there and you'll get them real quick. After that, I'm going to do a little bit more of a deep dive into the data I got on the dyno this time and look a little bit at the actual acceleration performance along with AFRs, acceleration in the real world and acceleration on the dyno. I'm going to be closing out the video with some sound clips of what this setup sounds like in the car and some quick closing thoughts. So without any further ado, here we go. Hey guys, so I'm getting ready to take the car to the dyno, and I wanted to give a brief overview of what I'd be doing today and also give a little bit of background for people who might have found this by searching YouTube instead of through the forums. So a couple weeks ago, I went and got the car dynoed at this same place, both to get a stock baseline before I made any serious modifications, and also to test a whole bunch of different intake setups. Before I went to the dyno, I did draggy testing with some intake setups and decided I wanted to do something a little more scientific. The car put down 207 to the wheels, completely stock with the stock airbox. I swapped in a modified airbox that had the carbon filter deleted and also has a K&N drop-in. Made a little bit more power, 2 or 3 more horsepower at peak, and over 7,000. It was a good 5 to 7 horsepower ahead of stock. I tried messing around with the suction tubes, and I found that the HKS suction tube, that's the post-MAF tube behind the airbox leading up to the throttle body, when it still had the small resonator installed, that seemed to perform a little bit better than the stock suction tube. The Greddy silicone suction tube, it kind of exacerbated the torque dip a little bit, maybe gave a little bit of extra power shortly thereafter, but overall it was a little bit worse than the stock suction tube. I also tested out the Perrin and AFE intakes. They were both worse than the stock airbox. The AFE was just flat out worse. It was basically identical up until 4,500. Then after 4,500, it kind of fell off a cliff and just performed notably worse than stock. Perrin was pretty strong in the low end and through the mid-range. It was clearly a little bit better than stock there. But on the top end, it was pretty similar, maybe a little bit worse. Then the last setup that I tested was the GR intake from TRD. And that one made pretty impressive gains. It put down 220 wheel horsepower at peak, 13 horsepower at peak gain from a cold air intake on a 2.4 liter is quite a bit of power. A good bit more than I was expecting. The top end over 7,000, it was a good 20 horsepower ahead of stock. And it also outperformed the modified airboxes by a little bit, which was roughly in line with my draggy testing, but I didn't expect the numbers to be quite that dramatic. So after I did the testing, I posted stuff up online, and I got feedback from some folks, including Mike from Counterspace, that I probably should have done more runs than I did. I did like 3 runs with each of these intake setups, and I was getting back-to-back numbers that looked pretty close to me. But Mike said that in his experience, it takes more like 5 to 10 runs for the car to really fully adapt. After he told me that, I went and logged some data with OBD2 myself on the street using the Perrin intake, both because I wanted to see what was going on, that it was falling off up top, and because I wanted to verify what he said. And unsurprisingly, he was exactly right. It took 7 runs for AFRs to really stabilize with that. And when they did stabilize, it was running really, really rich. Below 10.0 to 1, everywhere above 4,000 RPMs, which is probably why it was falling off a cliff. Suggests to me something's probably up with the MAF scaling there, and that intake really needs a tune in order to make power. So anyway, right now we have the stock airbox on the car, along with the SME headers in there. So our first run will be, just doing a comparison there. I'm planning on doing, 3 to 5 runs stock just to make sure we're fully warmed up. I just did a track day with this exact setup, so the car should be fully adapted here. After that, this is my modified airbox setup. So I've got the large resonator deleted. And if we open it up here, you can see we have no carbon filter, and we have the GR branded drop-in, which is really just a K&N drop-in filter. I've got these 2 different aftermarket suction tubes. This is the Greddy. It's a silicone tube that deletes the small resonator, and instead it has this kind of bulge here in the middle, a little bit of an inline resonator design. And then we have the HKS suction tube, which is a carbon fiber piece with silicone on both ends. It does have a place for the small resonator. I do also have the delete plug from Outbound Motorsports, so I'll be testing it both ways. But when I tested it last time, you were better off keeping the small resonator in there. And then last but not least, I have the big honking GR intake. That's got a big K&N panel filter in there. And otherwise, it's just a straight shot from the MAF back to the throttle body. So I'm planning on doing 10 runs with each of these intake setups. I'll be logging data while I'm doing it to make sure the car is really fully adapted this time. That should give, I think, better data that I can be a little more confident in where each of these intake setups actually stand, and if any of them actually make gains over the stock airbox, which is honestly pretty well designed. Should also give an idea if there's any interaction between the intake design and the design of the headers. And then after I do this next week, I'm going to be going back to the dyno again to do a little bit more testing, because I also picked up some JDL UEL headers for myself. I know some people have already done equal length, unequal length comparisons. The Stratified Auto one in particular was pretty thorough, really. But they were mostly testing first generation header designs. The second generation headers, they have larger diameter primaries generally. Like both the headers I'll be testing are 1.75 inch primaries and then 2.5 inch collectors, which is a little bit bigger than you usually saw for the Gen 1 cars. So figure getting a little more data there doesn't hurt anything. And we'll head off to the dyno and see what we find. So back from the dyno, just a quick reminder, we made 207 stock, and if we look at what the SME headers did, with the stock intake on there, they gave us a little bit of mid-range, maybe 10 foot-pounds or so, but up over 6,500 RPMs, they're actually a bit behind the stock headers, which really surprised me, given the reputation equal-length headers have for doing well up top.
So the next thing I did is I swapped in the modified JDM airbox I have. That's no carbon filter and a GR drop-in. Now we're starting to see some pretty substantial gains throughout the entire rev range. Up top, it's a good 15 plus horsepower above stock. Through the mid range, even there, it's up a good 15 foot pounds, 10 horsepower. So really, we're making gains basically throughout the entire usable power curve by combining these SME EL headers with a simple charcoal filter delete, which I think is pretty cool and interesting that just opening up the intake made that much of a difference. Okay, so here if we get the stock dyno graph out of the way, we can see just opening up the air box. We made solid gains throughout the rev range on these headers by doing that. The next thing I did here is I swapped in a couple different post-MAF tubes. I tried GR86 and HKS. So let's get those dynos pulled up and get the stock intake dyno out of the way. HKS is brown, GR86 is green, and as you can see, they're really pretty close to the stock MAF tube. The GR86 has a little bit of a dip right around 4,700. It's a negligible number of foot-pounds, 2 or 3 behind. And then it's up by maybe 3 to 5 foot-pounds, right around 5,500. It's really, going to be performing pretty much the same as stock. So those post-MAF tubes, those are all about the way your engine looks and it's how it sounds. All right, so here's our stock dyno backup, and here's the GR intake. This made the most peak power with the stock headers, and it made the most peak here too, almost 222. But it actually didn't do substantially better than just, our carbon filter delete. If we look at them here, it's actually behind a little bit in part of the mid-range. It's down on torque a little bit there. And then going over into the high end, above 7,100, it's down by as much as 10 horsepower up there. So on the stock tuning, the GR intake with these headers, it's not really getting you very much at all. You get to have a peak power number that's 2 horsepower higher, but that's not going to have any impact on actual real world performance. Now that we got the headline numbers out of the way, we can do a little bit of deeper dive into what's going on here. Like I said, initially, I was surprised to see this drop up top with the EL headers, even though, it confirmed what my butt dyno was saying, which is mid-range gains, not much up top. But it kind of makes sense when we look at this AFR curve. For whatever reason, with the stock intake, the car just is not doing a great job managing AFRs. It's running considerably lean down low, and then by the time we get up to high RPMs, it's down below 12.5 to 1. In an NA car like this, anytime you drop below 12.5, you might be starting to give up a little bit of power. We really want to stick in kind of that 12.5 to 13 range. If we look at how this impacts actual acceleration, we can look at speed versus time with these DynoJet runs. So they start accelerating at close to the same time here. And we can see, if you look that yellow line, which is with the SME headers, it's very slowly kind of pulling away from the stock, increasing that gap. And then it finishes just a little bit, a few tenths of a second faster. So even with that dip up top, that extra area under the curve these headers give us in the mid-range, there's still some performance advantage to be had there. Okay, let's get these graphs back to how they were. And we can see what happens once we reduce the restriction in the intake tract a little bit. And what we see is suddenly the car starts doing a great job of maintaining good AFRs as soon as we pull that carbon filter out of the airbox. I'm not sure if this is because the original ECU tuning that was done in Japan was probably done without that carbon filter in the airbox, and the extra flow from the headers just kind of throws things off enough. But it's and same thing if we add in these post-MAF tubes. We keep right around 13 to 1 basically throughout the whole rev range. So in addition to flowing more air that way, we're keeping better AFRs, which is why we picked up so much extra power on these headers just by opening up the intake tract a little bit. The other thing I think is really interesting is if we kind of take a look at how the headers themselves impacted the performance gain of these different intake setups versus the stock headers. So on the stock headers, opening up the airbox, it added a little bit of extra power up top, maybe a tiny bit in the mid range, but not that much. But if we add the headers on top of it, you can see we have consistent gains everywhere in the power band. The headers are adding like a good 10 to 15 foot-pounds throughout the entire mid range. And then, somewhere roughly in the neighborhood of 10 horsepower once we get up top. So adding power throughout the whole rev range like that's fairly substantial. That's going to create a noticeable difference in how the car responds. And, I just thought it was interesting. Deleting that charcoal filter gives you some small gains stock. But once you swap over to these equal length headers, it's practically a must-do mod. All right, so we can pull up our stock run 2 here just to get an idea of what we're doing. These all started at slightly different times after the record button was hit at the dyno. But if we zoom in on the start, we can get an idea of who started where. And just kind of looking at the slope of these curves, we can get an idea about actual performance. The stock intake started a little bit later than the others, maybe a quarter second. So the difference isn't quite as big as it looks at first glance here. But if we look at the actual slope of the curves, we can see that brown line, that's the headers and the modded intake. It opens up a gap on both setups and ends up getting to the top of fifth gear noticeably sooner. More than half a second sooner compared to the same intake setup on the stock headers, and a good second, close to a second of difference with stock, taking into account stock started a little bit later.
I think one of the more interesting things I saw in this testing is just the way that different intake setups interact with the headers when it comes to producing results. So just to recap, let's get this back to RPMs on the bottom here so we can actually, there we go. The GR intake was the strongest up top by a pretty considerable margin on the stock headers. It was up a good 10 horsepower over this modded airbox at 7,000 RPMs. Which, I thought was pretty impressive. That was more than I expected up top on the stock headers from an airbox. And if we look at how the headers, that's the GR, let's get the right file loaded here. If we look at how the headers interact with just that modified intake, we could see the headers add power everywhere, including up top. These guys are gaining about 10 horsepower throughout the rev range from the addition of the headers. If we look at the GR with and without the headers by contrast, we get a very different picture. The GR, it gets a pretty solid bump in the mid-range there. It's up nearly 20 foot-pounds at the point of the biggest difference. But then after 6,500 RPMs, it's performing more or less identically to how it performed on the stock headers. So unlike, our JDM airbox without the charcoal filter, where we picked up a bunch of extra power up top, that just didn't really happen with the GR intake. After 6,500, it's performing pretty much the same, whether it's on the stock headers or these SME EL headers. That suggests to me that there might be something else limiting airflow now, and there's just not a way to get power from more flow on the stock tune than what's provided either by the GR intake on the stock headers or the equal length headers plus the modded airbox. There has to be some other limiting factor there, I think. The other interesting thing about the GR headers is this drop off we see at very high RPMs. Obviously this intake flows well to be making power like it does. So why is it dropping off?
up top like that. And AFRs here, I think, can kind of paint the picture for us. If we look at the AFRs, as we already established, that JDM modified airbox, it's holding good AFRs all the way to redline. The GR intake just falls off a cliff right around 7100. It goes from 12.9 to 1 way down to 11.4 to 1, which is definitely richer than is optimal for making power. If we look throughout the red range, it's generally running a little bit richer than the stock airbox is overall. This makes me think that the GR intake would probably benefit from some tuning in order to get that AFR more in line with where we want it. And it's possible that it has a little more performance in it than what we're seeing. If the car were tuned properly for it, I definitely think it can hold power up to redline with proper tuning. And given it's running a bit richer than that modded stock airbox just about everywhere, but still doing pretty comparably otherwise, leaning it out just a tiny little bit, we might be able to gain something in tuning. So if we look at actual acceleration on the dyno here, speed versus time, let's take a look at the start. All right, so our GR intake in pink there is starting a teensy bit before modded stock airbox, maybe a tenth of a second or so, looking at things. 0.45 seconds versus 0.56. Yeah, so it's starting about a tenth of a second sooner. And if we look, these two lines are really staying pretty close to each other. So we aren't really seeing a big difference in performance between these two intake setups until we get to the very top end. So it does take the GR intake a little bit longer to hit redline here than it takes for the stock intake. The modded stock intake does it at 16.55 seconds. Whereas our GR intake is doing it at 16.7. So, it starts a tenth of a second earlier and still finishes a tenth of a second later. So that top end dip up there is actually costing it some real performance. So in real world terms, this simple carbon filter delete is probably the way to go. So another thing I ran into on the dyno that made life challenging at times was heat soak. It's very common for big horsepower cars to get on this dyno. Like there was a Ford GT parked on the lift right next to it that'd been on the dyno. But for whatever reason, their cooling setup just wasn't cutting it for my car. And I saw when I tried to do repeated runs, big power drop-offs from run to run. Oh, got it at a time here. Let's go back to RPMs so we can really see what's going on. So these are all runs with the GR intake. And we can see pink is the one I used as kind of like our demo run. That was one of the last runs I did, so I know it was fully adapted. Red was run number 1, and we can see when I tried doing back-to-back runs, power just fell off a cliff. The last couple runs, coolant temps were getting up to like 220 Fahrenheit there. And at that point, the car was dumping tons of fuel at the top end, presumably to try to cool things down, also pulling some timing, and it just wasn't making power. So that was a challenge that made it a little more difficult for me to get all these runs done in a more timely fashion. It also makes me think that these numbers might be lowballing things a bit. We can see the temperatures that the dyno thought it was when these runs were done. And for the 1 or 2 runs that I data logged on OBD2 before I needed to switch to OBD2 to get engine RPMs, I was seeing AITs well over 100. So the correction factor the dyno applied is based on temperatures that are more than 20 degrees lower than what the engine was actually seeing. So in terms of absolute numbers here, this is probably a little bit of a low ball compared to what the car was actually doing. But I think in terms of relative performance, it can probably still give us a pretty solid idea, unless one setup would just happen to be way more impacted by elevated AITs than anything else would. All right, so last thing I'm going to go over now that we're done with these dyno runs here, I'm going to be posting up a few draggy runs that I did. I did 30 to 80 mile per hour pulls in third gear, same on ramp, flat surface. I'm going to be showing you guys the stock intake, stock headers, GR intake, stock headers, and then the GR intake on these SME equal length headers. And what you can see looking at that, we picked up a ton of time in that in-gear pull. We're nearly a second faster through third gear compared to stock, over half a second compared to where we were with just the intake. And that's a real seat of the pants difference that you can actually feel when you're driving the car. So overall, I'm very impressed with the performance and build quality of these headers. They made power throughout the entire rev range. Kind of the conventional knowledge for headers on this platform, on the FA24D motor, has always been that you're better off going with unequal length because they provide a much stronger mid-range, and the EL don't really give any benefits up top. At least what I'm seeing with these EL headers is they're making gains everywhere. We picked up 15 horsepower basically everywhere above 4,200, which is pretty substantial. I am going to be dynoing the JDL UELs in the next few days. I'll be making a video on that so we can do a direct EL versus UEL comparison using two headers that I think are both well designed and that were designed for the Gen 2 cars with the FA24D engines. So that might give different results than what people were seeing earlier on, using headers that were designed for the FA20. Last comment I want to make, the only thing I don't love about these headers is the exhaust sound. I'm putting some clips up here. It's not terrible, but it's a little bit louder than I'd like, especially at cold starts. B, it's a little bit kind of buzzy and generic. It almost sounds like any other four-cylinder with a free-flowing exhaust on it. There's not really anything unique to it, and it's just not particularly pleasing to the ear to me. That's obviously subjective. Everybody's going to have different opinions. Some people might love it. If I do decide to keep these headers, I'll probably swap out my catback to see if we can change the sound around it all. With that, I hope you guys enjoyed this video and learned something, and I'll see you later after I get the JDLs dynoed.